George Darke is a Christadelphian who worships with the Riverwood Christadelphian ecclesia in Sydney. George is my brother in Christ, but out of respect I address him as Uncle George. Uncle George shares some memories from his life on Wilderness Conversations. Uncle George, you were born in 1936,
That's
which
right.
was right in the middle of the Great Depression. It was the year that Hitler was trying to be the good guy and hosted the Berlin Olympics. That's where Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals, quite famously.
And Hitler hated it.
And absolutely, for reasons we won't go into now. Uh, it was also the year the German airship, the Hindenburg, made its first flight and, of course, famously burst into flames a year later, sort of dashing the hopes of sort of the future transport of masses.
That's right.
And history's borne that out, of course. And so you were 9 years old when World War II finished. So do you
Yes.
remember those years of the war?
Yeah, to me, when the war finished, it was sort of a surprise because I'd only remembered war, really,
Yeah.
because I was only 3 when war broke out, and a lot had happened in all those years. I mean, because, uh, Dad had been in the British Navy. In fact, that's where he came into the truth, the British Navy.
In World War II or One?
World War One.
World War One, yeah.
Yeah, or just after the war it was, actually, in the 20s. There was a real consciousness, and we had, Mum's family were still in England. Many brethren and sisters were in England, so during those years we were making up food parcels for sending to both to family and to other brethren and sisters in the UK. So there was a very real consciousness of all that was happening, and because of our natural strong interest in Israel, the things that we were in those most of those early years, the murmurings we only sort of heard a bit about, but along with that, of course, there was a very strong Christadelphian involvement in the kinder transport situation in the UK.
Ah, yeah, okay, yeah.
So Mari's mum and dad in Rugby actually housed one of those children, and so there was a lot of interest, even though methods of communication in those days were nothing like they are now. But
Yep.
there was tremendous interest, and of course it was a bit of a focus for us because Granville Ecclesia started 2 weeks before the outbreak of war.
And we'll go back. So your dad was in the Navy, so he found the truth after that time, or in the Navy, as
Dad was actually a telegraphist, wireless operator in the Navy, and by that time they had 2 children in Britain, and Dad had been, at this particular occasion, he'd been on 2 6-month, what they called stints on the Singapore station. So he'd been away from home, from Britain for 2 periods of 6 months with only a few weeks between. He got back and was given a posting in the drafting office in the Plymouth dockyard, where his father-in-law was the chief gunnery officer, and there was Mum's dad was a naval officer. Her brothers, 2 of her brothers were naval officers, and her uncle was a naval officer. So, she always swore she'd never marry a sailor, but she did.
kept it in the family.
Yeah. And Dad was only there for a couple of weeks, and he suddenly got a notice to drafting him to the cruiser the Delhi, and he was incensed because the drafting office was a bit of sinecure because you were the one who drafted crew to ships, and you usually managed to keep yourself ashore.
So
for
that's
a long
what the
time.
purpose of the drafting office was.
Yeah,
Okay.
and but they said, well, sorry, Dark, Mum's uncle tried to cancel it. It had already gone to the Admiralty. He said the Delhi sails in 2 days. She needs 2 wireless operators. One has fallen ill, and you're the only one that's available. So off you go. And the other wireless operator was Harry Stowe, who had come into the truth. He met a young sister at Birmingham. She introduced him to the truth. He got baptised at Birmingham, and so he was still in the Navy at that point, and he'd already made application for discharge as a conscientious objector. First night out at sea, they started to talk about the world scene. He started to talk the truth to Dad. And in due course, they were based at Singapore, at Malta, and that's the point where they communicated by whatever means they had with the brethren at Plymouth, because Sister Stowe had now moved from Birmingham to Plymouth, and there were two other brethren from Plymouth, both actually still in the Navy in Malta, who, well, the brethren from Plymouth sent out the questions and answers to ask Dad, the whole thing. And
so he was actually baptised while he was away from home in that space of time.
He was baptised at Malta.
So does that mean
your
dad left your mum and came back as a baptised member of Christ?
Well, he never ever went back to England until 1967.
Oh, really?
Because they got their discharge in Sydney. His Dad as Harry Stowe, and then Dad started to talk to Arthur Clarke, and he said, "This is amazing how God's hand worked," because he said, "I wouldn't normally, walk across the deck to talk to Nobby Clarke, but I did." And the first greeting I got was a grunt, and then we got talking about the world scene, and I started to tell him about my newfound faith, and so he got interested, and they used to have a little Bible class in a well, it was called the rope locker. It was sort of
This is on the ship.
On the ship, yeah.
Amazing.
And so Dad was baptised, and they got this discharge in Sydney, and Arthur Clarke was baptised at Albert Hall, 413 Elizabeth Street.
So your mother came over.
My mum then came out on the ship with Sister Stowe, because they and.
So had she then communicated around the Bible? Like, were they religious in the first place?
Church of England,
right.
And so Sister Stowe spent 6 weeks at sea
talking to your mum,
talking to my mum about the truth.
Okay.
By the time she got to Australia, she was well on the way. But this is the sort of folly we get in ecclesial life, though. Brethren came to meet them in Melbourne, and in their wisdom, they said to Mum, "Well, of course, when you get to Sydney, you won't be able to sit with George in the meeting because you're not baptised."
Really? Is that how they? Was that a normal way? That was a
common thing,
And of course, George being not you, but your father, who had this, yours
right.
been named after him, yeah.
And but they didn't enforce that, and I don't think Dad would have tolerated it anyway. But that was a thing, Steve. When we were kids, even at Granville, we had these signs reserved for, families with young children, reserved for the unbaptised.
Is that right?
Yeah,
I had no idea.
But it was, as we grew up, as we started to get a family, we turned against that. I said, "Look, in Israel, the children worship with the parents, and that's what my children are going to do."
So you were born after this time. You were born in Australia.
I was born in Australia. Doreen and Margaret were born in England. I was. Mum and Dad were living at Doonside at the time, and they had a home right behind the Stows at Doonside. They were founding members of the Doonside ecclesia in 1927. And Dad had got a job in the Depression years. He got work installing electric motors for Sterling Henry, because the brother had a senior position at Sterling Henry, who were at the time at Summerhill, and Dad got several months' work installing this new equipment they had, and then he said to him, "Any other work?" And he said, "Well, all I got's a job in the dye house. I'll take it." So he was travelling to Doonside and back every day, which was a steam train to Parramatta and then electric train down.
So you would have been away from home for
Oh,
12 hours a day
yeah.
or thereabouts.
So they bought a house in Auburn.
So they moved because of the work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
where the M4 is now, and there were other brethren living around the area, and they were still going backwards and forwards to Doonside, because basically it was Doonside and Albert Hall. They were both Central Fellowship meetings in the day, and then of course there was Regent Hall, which was the Shield Fellowship. And some of these brethren, but then by the time in the mid 30s, the Doonside ecclesia disassociated from the Central Fellowship and allied themselves with the Shield group, because they became very distressed at many of the fellowship policies of 413, and they found all their discussions with all the brethren that they had come in contact with at Shield ecclesias. They all had the same view on the atonement that they'd grown up with and come into. So that's there were some of those brethren, got talking to Dad and said, "Why don't you start some lectures around the area, and maybe with a view we can start a meeting out this way." And
so that was the origins of Granville.
And that's the origins of Granville.
So when did they buy that hall? Do you know?
Well, they rented a hall in Reckerwhite Hall on Parramatta Road, Granville, which of course is long gone. And we occupied that hall until we moved into our own hall in 1952. We paid, all those years, the ecclesia paid 12 shillings and sixpence a week for the rent of that hall, which was wonderful. And I bought the block of land, we raised the funds, and we built the hall.
So you'd personally been a member of that ecclesia almost since your youth?
Well, I grew up in the Sunday school at Granville, and I was baptised at Granville. We were married at Granville. And Dad was the first recording brother and first superintendent at Granville, and he got us very, very involved. Mum and Dad were very committed, and nothing but illness would keep them away from the meeting.
What was it like being a young teenager and a teenager back in those days? What sort of activities did you attend were there other young people in the church?
We had other young people in the meeting. Yeah, it was that come in, moved in from other areas or grew up there, and we had quite a reasonable group at a reasonably decent sized Sunday school. In fact, it developed into quite a large Sunday school, and we did a lot of things in helping getting, raising funds for the hall and all that sort of thing. And
was there a broader Sydney CYC? Like, did you meet with other?
Basically all we had in those days, there was the Mansfield's class at Regent Hall, which was conducted by Brother Jim Mansfield, and that was once a month. The other class that was quite popular was the Hurstville Young People's class.
So these are ecclesias that were associated. Were they? I want to talk about the unity movement a bit later, but were they all ecclesias that were in the same fellowship?
Yeah, well, they all grew out of Regent Hall.
Right.
Yeah, I mean.
So there was a broader group of young people and young people's activities.
Yeah, it started to develop, fairly quickly. I think I've got a list of it, but I think Lakemba, I think, was the first one to start, and then Hurstville but Granville started in 1939, and there's an interesting little aside of why brethren need to be very careful, because we had a visiting brother gave a lecture at Granville, and the ecclesia had only been going for 2 weeks, and it was this time I think it was outside. It was actually at Granville Town Hall, and he said, quite affirmatively, he was a great believer in the pioneer position, and he couldn't accept the trend that was a lot of people were saying was that Germany was Gog. I mean, my dad was one amongst those who refused to accept that, but But
So they almost saw the Second World War as a fulfilment of Ezekiel 38
that's what
almost?
some of them were, yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah, it was a big move. Brother Thomas got it wrong. Germany is go.
But
And
this would have been, was this during the war or
this
after
was beginning of the
the
war,
beginning
right?
okay.
And through the war. And this brother stood up and he said, you know, I don't believe, under no circumstances will Britain declare war on Germany. And we walked out of the hall and a chap went past, you heard the news? No, what news? Britain's just declared war on Germany.
Right. Yeah, sort of,
That's why you
yeah,
have
not
to be
great for
very,
the credibility.
no, that's why you have to be so careful about making predictions. Yeah.
Stick to what the Bible says.
Yeah.
Probably good advice.
Yeah.
So where did you meet Auntie Mari?
Well, my mum and dad knew the brother and sister Forsyth quite well because they were all at 413 in those early years. And then in about early 1936, Mari's mum and dad, who only had Owen at the time, and Mari on the way, decided to go back to England to visit their families because Mari's mum and family were all around England. They weren't all in the truth. Dad had come from North London meeting, and of course, when they got back, things, while they were there, things started to turn ugly and it became more and more difficult to get any chance of getting back. And so they didn't get back to Australia until 1948. But the families had contact, and in fact, during that period of time, the brother and sister French went and visited, and they stayed with the Forsyths, and little Philip was with them, and he got quite cross because this little girl, Mari, scribbled all over his books, and he never let her forget that. So then when they came back, I knew about that, we had met actually afterwards, but Saturday nights we used to get the train into Regent Hall for the Mansfield's class. Once a month it was a Mansfield's class, and alternate 2 weeks it was Bellamy's social night at Regent Hall.
That sounds interesting. What was that? The social night?
It was like a games night,
okay,
which was held in the upper hall.
Okay.
And brother and sister Bellamy had started originally in their own home, and then it moved into the hall. And because Mari's family and quite a number of others lived out at Smithfield, the whole area where they lived used to be the property of Brother Barton, which was visited by Brother Roberts in the first voyage to Australia. Mari's auntie Agnes had a fairly big block of land, a big house, which had been Brother Barton's home, but the land had been subdivided to the point there was also Barton Street, and that's where the Forsyths and quite a number of other Christadelphians had their home. So they used to go into Concord West for their class the same Saturday night, and they had to get off at the front end of the train, and we had to get off at the back. So we'd be at the on the station at Auburn, waiting as the train went through. Oh, there's that Mari Forsyth from Concord. That's how I used to view it.
I find that extraordinary. So because you're in different fellowships, is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
it's amazing.
There was no intermingling.
Wow.
No, in fact, so much so, it was so. It was so vigorous and remained that way for a long time that there were brethren there who were almost happier for their kids to meet somebody outside than to get involved with someone from Central Fellowship.
Well, maybe that's a good segue into the unity movement, because no doubt with that sort of attitude prevailing, there would have been brother and sisters very keen to talk about unity, and that happened in the late 50s. And your dad was very much involved in that.
Well, yeah, there'd been a strong talk, but for a lot of years, even because the clear-cut issue in Australia was on the atonement. there've been two issues in Britain when there was a division. There were divisions there. One was the atonement, the other one was resurrectional responsibility, and it was the resurrectional responsibility that resulted in the amendment to the statement of faith. There were two things that became the amended statement of faith. One was the issue of the total inspiration of the scriptures.
So that's when the foundation was added to the statement of faith.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah, and that was because of the influence of Brother Ashcroft, and then there was the Turney views on the atonement, and Andrew's more extreme view on.
So was there in the amended statement of faith? Was there more than the foundation added?
There was the foundation, and there was a clarification on the resurrectional responsibility.
Oh, okay, I didn't realise that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's why you've got the amended and the unamended, because it's a resurrectional responsibility that is the difference between the amended and the unamended.
And that remains to today.
Today. And so there've been brethren, and there was the real issue was that the difference between the sound teaching of the Scripture, as Brother Thomas, Brother Roberts, had presented and had been adopted, generally by Christadelphians, but John Bell had really started to follow the view that had prevailed and brought division in England on the fact that Adam was actually created mortal.
And John Bell was a brother in Sydney, wasn't he?
John Bell was the editor of the Shield magazine. He was in Sydney at the time. In 1904, the division occurred, and they met at various places until they built a hall at Regent Hall in 1912.
Was the division uniform in the sense that either side would not meet with the other side? So it was everyone agreed on the division, or would one side meet with the other but not the other with the other, if you know what I mean?
No, the division was clear cut.
Right.
Because they wouldn't get involved with one another. But there was some.
And how many people in the ecclesias actually really understood the issues? Or was it really just some of the leaders who had a different view, and sort of then people?
I think it's always that way, Stu.
Yeah.
I think it's always that way. I don't think it's any different today. And that's one of the problems, because sometimes the leaders become more and more aggressive in their opposition, and the
damage is done to the bulk of the people in the ecclesias.
And then the extremes begin to develop on both ends. The greater number of people developed, like all the growth of the Christadelphian movement in Australia was predominantly with the Shield ecclesias, not with the Central Fellowship.
Certainly in New South Wales, or would you say around Australia in general?
Pretty much around Australia. Right. There weren't a lot, there were lots of little isolated groups. Like there was a small meeting at Wagga, which was central.
Is that because they were more outward focused, or outward thinking, or more moderate, or what would you put that down to?
I think it was a reaction. A lot of cases, I think it was a reaction to what was perceived as the extreme view of those in the Central Fellowship. Now, I think that perception about extreme is not necessarily always correct.
So that means during the 40s and early 50s, this situation prevailed in New South Wales and Sydney in particular, and no doubt potentially through the rest of Australia.
In Melbourne, you had Horticulture Hall and Latrobe Street, who wouldn't have anything to do. In fact, as a brother Mullins left 430, this was in the post-war period, left Horticulture Hall and went to Latrobe Street, or he went and visited Latrobe Street, and when he went back to Horticulture Hall the next Sunday, he was greeted at the door as Mr. Mullins.
It's a terrible thing to think about.
It's awful, and that was the sort of thing that provoked the brethren at Doonside to say, look, it was my mum and dad.
So is that what spurred the idea of unity and to really go back and examine this? What prompted that?
Well, as time went on, and the impact of this separation because there'd also been a separation, in Britain, and so you had the Suffolk Street group of ecclesias and the Temperance Hall group, which was Birmingham Central. They were not in fellowship with one another, and so ultimately Central Fellowship was connected out here. Were connected with Temperance Hall, and the Shield group allied themselves with Suffolk Street. So if anyone went to England, they could, from Central Fellowship, they could go to the Suffolk Street on whatever meetings were in fellowship with Suffolk Street.
I mean, the irony of that was there wouldn't have been a lot of people going to England back in those days. It was not
Oh,
like
no.
you could jump on a plane and go to England.
No. It was
a
5
massive,
or 6 weeks on a ship to go to England.
Very expensive, I imagine.
Oh yeah, that's right. And they went through all those generations. They were the years when cricketers would spend 6 weeks on a ship and keep practicing while they were sailing over to England to play cricket. So that was the era. But there were many brethren, and my dad was one of them. Harry Stowe was another, and quite a few others who were very anxious to try and bring about unity. And in fact, the editorship of the Shield after the death of Brother Bell was picked up by brethren in Adelaide, and Brother C.P. Walker edited it for many, many years. And they in the late 40s, early 50s, some of those brethren were saying, well, look, we do have differences of view, but rather than attacking those we disagree with, we ought to look and see whether, in fact, the fundamentals are there, and we can agree on fundamentals. That
was there shifting sands in terms of what people believed, or was it just language that was being refined?
Some people have never shifted. We still have people in our midst who do believe that Adam was made mortal. There's no doubt about that. The question, Steve, is whether we want to try and purge them, or rather, uphold the truth properly.
So thankfully, we had brethren who saw the value of trying to resolve these issues and the value of unity.
And a lot of them worked very hard. Dad and Harry Stowe, from their early years, really, represented their ecclesias on the Central Standing Committee. W.G. Brown was the chairman. He was also the first chairman of the Homes.
So this was a committee that was set up for the purpose of seeing
the Central Standing Committee was founded on the London Central Standing Committee as a means of communication for the Brotherhood. All right.
Oh, okay.
But that committee, played a very active role, and when W.G. Brown died, Dad was appointed chairman, and then they were working hard, and so they decided to appoint a unity committee, of which Dad was also made the chairman, and he worked very closely with a lot of very fine brethren.
What years would these have been? Like early 50s?
Early 50s, yeah. Because 1952, I think, was the year of unity in Britain. They got unity a bit earlier in Melbourne than anywhere else because of the work amongst others, Brother Thorneloe from England and others, so the horticultural hall at Trove Street divide didn't exist.
There was obviously a request, or was it an offer that Brother Cooper and Brother Carter come to Australia? How did that come about?
After reunion in Britain, the brethren out here then began to communicate, because Brother Carter was the editor of the Christadelphian, and he wrote a lot, and he was invited to come and speak at the Melbourne conference.
Do you remember what year that would have been? 57.
It would have been 55, I think, because he then, Brother Carter and Brother Cooper then wrote their letter, which was actually read at the subsequent conference in Adelaide 2 years later. So there's a lot of work done, and Brother Carter was invited to come out. He spoke at the conference, and he did a lot of work. He went around and he attempted to get Concord West on side. But this gives you an idea of how extreme people's attitudes get. The brethren on the committee, my dad and the other brethren on the Unity Committee, had arranged for Brother Carter to speak to the Concord West brethren at Parramatta Town Hall. When they arrived with Brother Carter, they weren't allowed in. Only Brother Carter could go in. They wouldn't have anybody else in there. And so
in today's world, it seems almost unbelievable.
Yeah,
doesn't it? It's so different to what we would consider to be reasonable.
They gave him a torrid time, because they really hated this whole concept of unity. There were many in the Concord West who actually, some had already left. Murray's mum and dad, when there was unity in England, Murray's mum and dad, and they left Concord West, and mum and dad joined Regent Hall, and Murray joined Granville. And the day first Sunday at Granville, Faye Wilson-Coffey, who'd also come, she was Faye Taylor, she'd come from 413 a little earlier. She said to Murray, "There he is, George Darke, that's the one I was telling you about." She said, "I know him, he'd be right for you."
The rest is history, as they say.
The rest is history, as they say. Yeah, but Dad said when Brother Carter came out of that meeting, he looked like a washed-out rag. He was exhausted. But he gave two wonderful addresses.
Are they the ones recorded in the Unity book?
Yeah. He gave that address on the Atonement.
Where was that given?
Well, I think he gave it interstate, but he gave it at Sydney Town Hall, Lower Town Hall. It was a wonderful meeting.
You were there?
I was there, yeah. My dad was the chairman. And
what are some of your memories of Brother John Carter? Is there anything in particular that stand out?
A very lovable, gentle person, and one of the phrases that sort of sticks in your memory, he said, "You can't separate the man from the work that he came to do."
And he would talk slowly and deliberately like that.
Very deliberately. And when we talk about, don't try and get a splinter out of your brother's eye when, you've got the mote in your own eye. Well, he was very expressive. He said, what we got to think of is you're trying to take a splinter out of your brother's eye when you got a plank over your own eye. And he was...
And was it that attitude that won people over?
I think he the integrity of the brother, really, for those who were looking to learn his integrity and his ability to quietly and faithfully explain the word, really won people over. And then of course, subsequently, the brethren continuing, and there was this the meeting for resolving unity was getting stronger and stronger, and they that's why they asked Brother Carter and Brother Cooper if they could write. They said, we don't want to rewrite clauses 5 and 12, but it would be helpful if you could try and write something that would maybe, clarify the confusion that exists in the minds, because there was this absolute hatred of the word defiled in clause 5. And the Regent Hall Constitution actually has condemned, not defiled, in the wording. And
that's because people were looking at it from different points of view.
Yeah, that's right.
With a different understanding.
Yeah. And
not necessarily disagreeing primarily with what they believed, but the way they read the word.
Yeah.
So what we now know as the Cooper Carter Addendum.
Yeah.
Did that go through drafts, or was it produced by our brethren and it was almost...
No, what we have, and it's not, and it never was an addendum to the Statement of Faith. It was an addendum to Brother Carter and Brother Cooper's letter. They wrote the letter to the conference, and the addendum to that letter was their explanation, of clauses 5 and 12 that they thought would be helpful. And therefore...
So that's where the word addendum comes from.
That's right.
Okay,
yeah.
I've always assumed it.
Yeah.
Addendum to the Statement of Faith.
Yeah, it never was. There was never an addendum. Okay. The Statement of Faith has never been changed since it became the Birmingham Amended Statement of Faith. But it was the addendum to the Carter-Cooper letter. And
so the original letter, that's what we've got now as the Cooper-Carter addendum?
That's exactly the wording that was the attachment to their letter. Yeah, it was accepted, and...
So was it at that conference where ecclesias gave their...
Well, the conference meeting gave the assent to put this whole proposed unity agreement out to the ecclesial world. The conferences are not, sort of a binding gathering, but it was... the conference voted that in favour of distributing the agreement to invite ecclesias to sign and agree.
We've been talking about unity and some of the challenges that were around in those times. For young people listening today, they would be completely bamboozled by what you're saying, because we just take it for granted. And in fact, it's probably fair to say that there's even a movement around today that almost says, well, even fellowship itself is really not that important in a sense. And we can't even be that dogmatic about what you need to believe to be a member or attend our worship services.
Yeah, there is that mindset. But the reality is, Steve, that, the whole community of religious bodies claiming to be Christian all say the Bible is their basis, So you can't just make that claim. You have to have something that, identifies the things that you believe. And the reality is that, we began as a community of people, of believers, based on those things that we believe. And yes, there can be peripheral things, but surely it has to be, fundamental that you can't sit down around the same table with someone who believes in the Trinity, or the devil, which is an abomination to God. And so
sort of fundamental differences.
You've got to be able
even who God is.
Yeah, you've got to be able to define what you believe, and there are I know we don't agree with the way they do things, but you can't just wander in and sit down at Jehovah's Witness meeting and partake of whatever it is they do. They might welcome you to sit in and listen and watch, but so fellowship is a fellowship of people with a common faith in the truth. And if people don't want that as their basis, then they are free to walk away from it. I don't encourage them to do that, but the reality is, having a belief is important. Otherwise, why did the apostles very strongly differentiate against the gospel, between the gospel and Judaism? After all, Judaism was based on the scriptures. It was, and that's where the problem the Judaizers have. They couldn't let go of the legality of it, and that's where sometimes the application of our the way in which we fellowship, the way in which we meet, becomes almost extreme, and that can be a discouragement in itself. And that's where we do need to get a balance. And And there are things, unfortunately, that have offended people upon which there should never have been a difference, you know.
There's no doubt that when you've got unity, and we've had unity for many years. I mean, there's always been differences and those sorts of things we understand, but primarily speaking,
we're human beings.
We've had an amazing, well, couple of generations of a wonderful environment in the truth. But because it's always been there, we can then lose the fact of, well, we forget to treasure it, I guess, is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean, the joy in the brotherhood generally in post 1958 was just incredible, because suddenly we were able to meet with people that, you know, we weren't allowed to meet with for so many years. When we were organising the 1955 Youth Conference, and that committee was me.
So this was a conference in Sydney?
Youth conference.
Youth conference in Sydney.
It was
Had you already been to, you mentioned a youth conference in Adelaide at Victor Harbour.
I went to the Adelaide conference.
Was that the first ever youth
conference?
The
first youth conference was in Olinda in Victoria in 1951. I wasn't quite old enough for that. My sister Audrey went. I went in 1953, which is where I made a lot. That was at Victor Harbour. Made a lot of friends that some of them have passed on, but I still have many good friends I made.
Can you tell us about that conference just a little bit? Like how many people were there and where was it?
I think
it was at Victor Harbour, obviously.
Yeah, I think there was about 120 young people. It was held in the Central Guest House in the main street of Victor Harbour, and there was a bit of an overflow group in the it was a hotel, but they were temperance hotels next door. Wonderful experience for me, it really was. We had
How did you get there?
By train. A whole group of us went, train down to Melbourne, and then overnight, a train to Albury, change, get on the Spirit of Progress down to Melbourne. Then we were looked after by brothers and sisters in Melbourne for the day. Then we got the overland train to Adelaide, and
I mean, these were days when travel was not as prevalent as it is today.
Oh no, it was quite an event, and the conference fee was 2 weeks' wages for me, and then I had to pay the transport to get across there. We were wonderfully treated while we were there, and it really was a wonderful experience. And
who were the movers behind that? Who thought that was a good idea?
Well, it originally started with the brethren in Melbourne.
At the first conference.
The first conference, and it's interesting because after my second conference, I went and stayed. When I went down and stayed with it was after that first conference, I went to Melbourne and I stayed with David Kennett, his family, our brother Gordon Kennett, who was, I think he might have been the recorder at Latrobe Street in those days. No, at Baldwin. They'd been at Latrobe Street. Lovely, real gentleman. And he said, George, he said, when the move came to try and, get a youth conference going, he said, I was opposed to it. I felt that we just should worship and fellowship together as families. But he said, I'm happy to say that I've changed my mind because I can see the benefit from that conference. And but it was a group, I'm not sure exactly who it was, but it was a group in Melbourne who were responsible for that. And then it was voted that the next conference go to Adelaide, and they did a great job. Peter Hearn was the secretary, and one of the little funny things that happened, I was invited to speak at the open air meeting on the Sunday afternoon. And I was having a chat to Murray Lund afterwards, and Murray was on the committee. I mentioned it the first time I'd spoken in the open air, meeting, and he said, I thought you spoke at the Sydney Domain. We saw the Domain program. I said, no, that was my father. He's George too. It was my first introduction to actual open air speaking, but David Pogson and I used to go to Domain every Sunday afternoon for years. And very often it was just David and Ted Pongberg and me that would be down there. But
they would have been interesting years.
Oh yes, they were.
So the conference then in Sydney. So you're on the committee?
I was on the committee. We talked about getting it into Sydney, and they agreed, and the next one would come to Sydney. So then we started to talk about getting a committee together, and we set up. We sort of had a little interim committee that then put out a ballot through all the young people's groups in Sydney to vote for a conference. And so the committee was formed. Ted Russell became the secretary. There was me, Basil McClure, Shirley Angel, as she was then. She's now Shirley Carroll. Bev Bacon, who became Beck Russell, and Barry Brown from Regent Hall. And so we got to work, and we decided on we set up a study notes committee, which was I was on it as the representative of the general committee and took my role. Then it was Ted Spomberg, Roland Pogson, and Keith Cook, I think. We were the ones who wrote.
What was the subject?
Well, we had 5. They were study groups. We didn't have individual speakers and study groups. But one of the key subjects was the fellowship of his sufferings. And we used to hold our committee meetings on Sunday night at Regent Hall after the lecture. And this one particular night, after we'd sent out a circular notifying the subjects that we were going to deal with in the studies sessions, Ted and Basil and myself were bailed up after the lecture by 3 senior brethren from Regent Hall. They're very concerned about this subject, the fellowship of his sufferings. We really don't think you should be studying that. It's too contentious. And Ted Russell was, he was really quite blunt. He said, "Brethren, it is only contentious because you, brethren, refuse to allow it to be discussed because it's contentious. We are going to deal with that subject at the youth conference." And we did.
And Ted presumably was in his early 20s himself. Like around your age?
Yeah, he was a bit older than me, a few years older than me. But,
it's quite a bit of courage back then, wasn't there, amongst the younger ones?
Well, yeah, because, we did want to see, we really caught enthusiasm from our contact in Adelaide, and we really, wanted to, get a lot of things happening, and so it really was a great experience, and we actually put on a special night at the conference at which we invited Perce Mansfield to come over as a guest speaker to talk to the young people about Bible marking, the whole concept of Bible study and Bible marking. And it was from that conference that I ordered my first wide margin Bible, which is the one I still use most. My new Bible that I bought about 40 years ago, I don't use that much yet because all my notes are in the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was a really great experience, and
it went well.
It went well. It was a good conference, very good conference. A lot of people have some misconceptions about the history of some of our functions in truth, right? And a lot of terminology, just our young people's activities, like the CYC. Originally, when I was young, there was only the one. It was before I came into the truth. It was the YCLA, the Young Christadelphian League, initially of Australasia, but then they brought it back to Australia. So that was the young people's activity. You had to be baptised to be a member of the YCLA. But in Britain during the war, they had formed the CYC, and it was because of government legislation requiring that all children from 10 years and upwards had to be involved with a young people's group, some sort of young people's activity. So,
It was actually legislated.
well, yeah, what they legislated during the war, they legislated because they wanted to be able to really, their view was to protect young people, to be able to, you know where they all were, sort of thing, during the war. And there were difficult reasons. So, the brethren in England didn't want young people joining the Boy Scouts or things like that. So they created the Christadelphian Youth Circle. It took a few years for that thinking to start in Australia, but the brethren, subsequently decided that we needed something for young people here other than those who were baptised. So they decided to form the CYC, which worked sort of together with the YCLA and under the umbrella of the YCLA, but it was for unbaptised young people.
Mm.
It was the work of brethren like Arthur Clarke and Keith Cook, particularly, who were then in the 50s, were very active in the YCLA, who just saw it was incongruous to have two separate groups. And so
We'd lose the benefit of the mentoring and the example of the elders.
So they worked hard to get support for the idea of just merging them all and just dropping the YCLA name and just calling it all the CYC. And at the time of the 1955 Youth Conference, this whole process was happening, and they had a final draft on it. So although we had no power in terms of the decision making, we decided to put it to the conference business session to get the young people behind it. And so it was, emphatically endorsed by the young people, and we communicated back to the brethren that this is how the young people feel about it. We had 150 at Wyong.
I wanted to ask you about Israel.
Mm-hmm.
1948, if my calculations are correct, you were just 12, and then in 1967 you were 31.
Yep.
What do you remember of 1948 and then 1967?
1948, I remember the incredible enthusiasm in the Brotherhood.
Even as a 12-year-old?
Even as a 12-year-old, because the atmosphere of my own family was electric, you see, and I was very close to other, we had the Wrights. I was very close with the Arthur Wright, was a great friend of mine, and his dad was very, very excited about it. So it was talked a lot about in the meeting, and it was a really electric atmosphere. And there was great anticipation about what was coming because, the brethren had read, all the work of Theodore Herzl, and all the Balfour Declaration was something of great excitement in the post-World War One days. And
it was almost a generation before. Now you've got almost a new generation who witnessed the appointment of the nation of Israel.
That's right. And then, of course, we had a very, very strong emphasis on prophecy. There was, great enthusiasm, and then things sort of quietened down a bit. But then 1956 was the next significant event with the Suez Crisis, because they bombed the ships in the Suez Canal and blocked the canal. That was a period of great excitement because, there was, the thing that excited the brethren particularly was the way that some of the major nations came to the help of Israel, in those circumstances.
So it really demonstrated the establishment of that nation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which was always tenuous in the early years.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. They didn't have, the things at their disposal. I mean, when they were first formed, Britain, that had been, the proud champion of a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine, became the greatest obstacle, in trying to get there, particularly in the post-war years, and when they, basically Britain, walked out of the mandate responsibility and handed all their weapons to the Arabs. So
1967 then came, almost out of the blue.
1967.
Was there talk about Jerusalem before that? Did people say, well, they don't control Jerusalem, that needs to happen? Or was that detail sort of not?
Individual brethren talked about it, but it wasn't really interpreted by many as sort of a negative in the sense, Israel's there, and they, they have part of Jerusalem, but when the 6-Day War was launched, when really Israel started it, because they knew if they didn't move first, the overwhelming forces. I mean, every time they've had this battle with the Arabs, the numbers of and weaponry of the Arabs so vastly outnumbered that of Israel that numerically they didn't have a chance, but they did, and so they promptly destroyed the whole Egyptian Air Force on the ground. And
they say it was won within the first 3 or 4 hours.
Yeah. Because suddenly the Egyptians had no planes to take off.
Yeah.
And
what was the effect in the ecclesial world? In your world, was it exciting?
There was great excitement. Yeah, in those days, there was great excitement. And I think generally in the Brotherhood there was a great excitement. In those days, we used to run. We'd run special newspaper ads and all sorts of things. We'd run special lectures when these things happened,
When you think back over the years, how has the world changed? And I suppose then a second question would be, how has the ecclesia changed over these years?
Interesting questions, Steve. I think in terms of the world, one of the biggest impacts, of course, is the rapid communication, and that affects the whole world. And I well remember back even in the days when Bob Menzies was Prime Minister, when there was some financial problem starting to develop in Europe or the US. We probably had 3 or 4 months to prepare for it out here. Now you've got about 3 minutes.
The global community.
Yeah, and the global transfer, the almost instant transfer of funds globally and things like that. And that makes a big difference to the way people react and the way. And I think the huge difference impacting on society today is part of all that communication thing. People were also more willing and open to talk about things, even though we lamented the fact that we didn't get the response that earlier generations had got.
So the interest in the Bible, interest in God, and so on has waned over the years.
Yeah, there was a more willingness to talk, and people were respected, even if people didn't agree with what you taught and what you believed. People had a great willingness to respect the way you lived. And it's interesting. I remember my dad saying on one occasion, the general manager at Sterling Henry said to him, we expect more from you, George, in terms of morality and integrity. And he said, "Oh, is that really fair?" Oh, he said, I think it's quite fair because you make no secret of what you stand for. Therefore, we say it's important that you uphold the things you stand for.
What advice would you give younger people today based on your years of experience?
Well, first and foremost, understand our history. take the trouble to understand our history, because it's been a long established principle in world history that a nation that ignores its history will make the same mistakes as its predecessors. And the same thing will happen in ecclesial life. So understand the history and try to avoid the mistakes and pursue the positives. And like Brother Roberts and Brother Thomas were wonderful brethren. Were they always right? No, in terms of the way things were done, probably not. I believe doctrinally they were right, but Brother Thomas's own knowledge developed and evolved over the years. He became more conscious and aware of some things.
I feel like we could talk for hours, but I really appreciate your time. It's just been fabulous to hear some of your life stories.
Oh, yeah, it's great. I do really, and I think back over it, I think that not only do I owe much to my parents and to Mari's parents, but to many other brethren and sisters who've influenced me in my life in the truth. And I love them for it.
Well, I'm sure there's many that feel the same way about you. So it gets passed from generation to generation, doesn't it?
When I think of the benefit that I've received from others in the truth, I just try and pass it on if I can.